The slap landed like a gunshot in the middle of the summer gala, sharp and sudden, and absolutely impossible to ignore, cutting through 300 conversations and the soft swell of a string quartet until the entire ballroom went silent in the span of a single heartbeat. Heads turned. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. A photographer's camera clicked once, reflexively, before the man lowered it, as if he were unsure whether he had just witnessed something real. And at the center of it all, standing beneath a chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a decade, stood a woman in a gray cleaning uniform, her cheek burning, her eyes steady, her mop handle still gripped in one hand, as though the world had not just shifted beneath her feet. Her name was Angela Brooks. She was 42 years old, and not one person in that glittering room knew that the man who had just struck her across the face worked for her. Angela had arrived at the Harrington Grand Hotel at 4:30 that afternoon, 2 hours before the first guests were expected. The way she always arrived, early, quiet, prepared. She wore her standard uniform, the gray polyester shirt with the Sterling Holdings Facilities staff patch stitched above the breast pocket, the kind of patch that made people look through you rather than at you. She carried her cleaning caddy up the service elevator, pressed herself flat against the wall, when a hotel florist rolled past with an enormous arrangement of white orchids, and made her way to the VIP reception corridor without being asked twice. She knew the layout of the Harrington, as well as she knew her own apartment. She had cleaned it 5 times before, always for this event, always for the Sterling Holdings Summer Charity Gala, which was the social centerpiece of the company's calendar, and the most important night of the year for a man like Richard Sterling. The gala raised money for children's educational foundations, a cause Angela believed in genuinely, though she never said so to anyone at work. She had learned, over the years, that opinions spoken aloud by women in gray uniforms tended to disappear into the air. So she kept her thoughts to herself, moved through rooms with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that good work rarely required an audience, and found her satisfaction in smaller things. A corridor that gleamed, a restroom that smelled of fresh linen, a marble floor so well buffed it caught the light like still water. The other members of the cleaning staff liked Angela. They gravitated toward her during break times, not because she said much, but because of the quality of her silence, the sense that she was genuinely present, genuinely listening, that whatever you told her would be received with care and not repeated carelessly. Marcus, the security guard who worked the East Wing, often saved her a cup of coffee from the break room. Denise, who handled the executive floor restrooms, called her Miss Angela, even though Angela was only 4 years older. When something went wrong, a cart broke down, a spill needed 2 people, a supply closet was locked, and nobody could find the key, people came to Angela first. She solved problems without making others feel small about having them. She was not the kind of person you noticed right away. That was, in its way, entirely by design. Richard Sterling, by contrast, was the kind of person you noticed before he entered a room. He had the bone structure of someone who had been told since childhood that he was exceptional, and he had never found sufficient reason to question that assessment. He was 38 years old, lean and well-tailored, with silver beginning to thread through his dark hair in a way that a gossip columnist had once described as distinguished. He moved through spaces as though they had been arranged for his benefit, which, in the case of the Harrington Grand's main ballroom on this particular evening, they largely had been. The floral arrangements had been approved by his assistant according to his specifications. The menu had been reviewed by his personal chef. The lighting had been calibrated by an events team that knew, without being told explicitly, that Richard Sterling preferred his face to catch the warm amber wash from the overhead fixtures rather than the cooler tones near the windows. He believed, with the uncomplicated confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged, that Sterling Holdings was the product of his vision, his drive, and his relentless personal ambition. He spoke about the company in the first person singular. He referred to the board's decisions as his decisions. He stood at the podium at quarterly meetings and accepted applause with the relaxed grace of a man receiving something he was owed. What Richard did not know, and what Angela had spent 7 years making sure he would not easily discover, was that Sterling Holdings had 2 founders, his father, Gerald Sterling, and a man named Thomas Brooks, who had been Gerald's closest friend, his business partner, and in many ways the quieter but steadier architectural mind behind the company's earliest and most important structural decisions. Thomas Brooks was the kind of man who arrived first and left last, who wrote detailed notes in the margins of every contract he reviewed, who held the numbers in his head with an accuracy that his colleagues found remarkable, and that he himself regarded simply as the minimum standard of care owed to something you were building to last. He and Gerald had disagreed on many things over the years, and had resolved every disagreement by returning to the same question: what does this company owe the people who depend on it? Thomas Brooks was Angela's father. He had died 11 years ago, leaving behind a daughter he had raised alone. After her mother's passing, a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood on the east side of the city, a worn Bible with his handwriting in the margins, and arranged through a legal instrument that even his own attorney had taken pains to document meticulously, a controlling interest in Sterling Holdings held in trust to be transferred to Angela upon her 40th birthday or at such time as she chose to assert her rights. Angela had turned 42 18 months ago. She had not yet chosen to say a word. She had her reasons. She had spent those 18 months doing what she had spent the previous 5 years doing: watching, learning, understanding the company, not from the perspective of a boardroom, where everything was framed in quarterly projections and strategic language, but from the floor, the literal floor, the one she mopped. From that vantage point, she had learned things that no executive summary could have told her. She had learned which managers spoke respectfully to their staff, and which ones didn't bother to look up from their phones. She had learned which departments ran smoothly because of strong internal culture, and which ones ran on fear. She had learned, by being invisible in spaces where important conversations happened, that the distance between what leadership said about its values and what leadership actually practiced was, in the case of Sterling Holdings under Richard's stewardship, significant enough to matter. She had sat in a supply closet while a department head told his team, in language that no HR policy would have permitted in writing, that their feelings about the workload were their problem and not his. She had listened, from a utility hallway, while two senior managers discussed which junior employee they intended to credit for work that a third employee had clearly done. She had catalogued, without bitterness but with steady attention, the texture of power as it was actually exercised in this building. On ordinary days, when nobody was presenting to investors or performing for the press, she had learned that the loading dock crew, 12 people who started at 5 in the morning and received no benefits beyond the legally mandated minimum, had not had a wage increase in 4 years, despite the fact that Sterling Holdings had posted record profits for 3 of those same 4 years. She had taken notes. She had filed documents. She had built, quietly and systematically, a case. But on the evening of the summer charity gala, all of that was still safely held in the understanding between herself and her attorney, a 71-year-old man named Martin Reeves, who had known her father for 40 years and who had been waiting, with the patient faith of someone who had watched enough of the world to trust the right person's timing for Angela to decide she was ready. She was almost ready. She had not yet decided she was entirely there. Then the champagne spilled. It happened the way most disasters happen at formal events: quickly, accidentally, through no particular fault of anyone except proximity and the inherent instability of tall flute glasses on polished surfaces. A man in a tuxedo laughed too hard at something his companion said. His elbow caught the edge of a passing server's tray, and a full glass of champagne arced downward in a slow, glittering curve and struck the marble floor of the main reception corridor, exactly 6 feet from where Richard Sterling was standing, with a group of investors, explaining, with great enthusiasm and his particular brand of authoritative warmth, how Sterling Holdings had achieved its latest growth benchmarks through. And here he paused, as he always did, for maximum effect visionary leadership. Angela had been working 20 feet away. She saw the spill before the server even had time to react, and she moved toward it automatically, the way she always moved toward messes efficiently, without drama, without waiting for someone to tell her it was her job. She brought her cart alongside the puddle, set a caution marker, and knelt to absorb the liquid with a dry cloth before it could spread across the marble and create a slip hazard for the 300 formally dressed guests currently navigating the corridor. She was focused. She was thorough. And she was, in the way of someone who has been doing this work for 7 years and knows exactly how much space her body occupies in relation to the furniture and the people around her, careful, But Richard Sterling stepped backward without looking. He was gesturing as he spoke, one of his characteristic wide arm movements that his team had privately learned to give a 2-foot radius of clearance to during high-energy moments. And his right heel came down directly onto the edge of Angela's cloth. And when he shifted his weight, the momentum transferred, and the cloth jerked sideways, and the remaining liquid in the soaked fabric sprayed upward in a thin arc, and caught the lower half of his white dress shirt and the lapel of his charcoal vest in a scatter of champagne droplets that, in the context of the pristine perfection of the evening he had choreographed, looked to Richard Sterling like a personal assault. He turned. He looked down. He saw Angela on one knee, cloth in hand, looking up at him. The expression that crossed his face was not one of irritation finding its way toward composure. It was something that had been sitting just beneath the surface all night, a tension that had been building since the car service ran 7 minutes late, and the centerpieces arrived, a shade too warm in tone, and the keynote speaker had required a second round of rehearsal, and the sight of this woman in a gray uniform, having apparently splashed liquid on his clothing, in front of the investors he was trying to impress, simply released it. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" he said. His voice was not quite shouting, but it carried, the way voices carry when a room has gone partially quiet in anticipation of something. Angela began to stand. "I apologize, sir. There was a spill on the floor, and I can see there was a spill. I can also see that you've now put it on my jacket." He looked around at the investors, and in that look was something calculated. A performance of exasperation, meant to signal that he was a man above such inconveniences, that this disruption was external to him, rather than within his capacity to manage gracefully. "This is exactly the kind of incompetence I've been dealing with all—" "Mr. Sterling." Angela kept her voice level. "I was cleaning the floor before you stepped back. The contact was accidental." Something in the precision of her sentence, the calm, the complete absence of deference in her tone, seemed to reach him in a way that a more frightened response would not have. His jaw tightened. He stepped closer. "You do not," he said, very quietly now. In the register he used when he wanted to be certain someone understood the weight of his authority. "Speak to me in that tone. You don't get to explain yourself to me. You get to do your job correctly, and tonight you haven't done that. So I suggest you collect your things and remove yourself from this event immediately." Angela looked at him. She held his gaze, and in her eyes there was something he clearly had not expected. Not anger, not fear, but a quiet and steady disappointment. The look of someone who has been observing a person for a long time and has just seen exactly what they expected to see confirmed. "Are you certain," she said softly enough that only he and perhaps the two nearest investors could hear, "that this is how you want to handle this situation?" Richard Sterling raised his right hand and struck her across the left cheek. It was not a hard blow by the technical measure of such things, but it was a blow, deliberate, contemptuous, designed to communicate something that words apparently hadn't achieved. And in the sudden quiet of the corridor, where the string quartet had paused between pieces, it was heard by everyone. 300 people turned and looked. The sound hung in the air long after the echo of it faded. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A woman near the back of the gathering covered her mouth with her hand. One of the investors Richard had been speaking with took a slow step sideways, increasing the distance between himself and Richard in the particular way of a man recalibrating his associations in real time. Angela did not raise her hand to her cheek. She did not cry. She did not step backward. She simply stood, perfectly still, and looked at Richard Sterling with the same expression as before, that same quiet, measuring disappointment, and said, in a voice that carried further than she likely intended, "I see." Then she turned, set her cloth neatly on top of her cleaning cart, and walked down the corridor toward the service exit, with the unhurried dignity of a woman who has somewhere more important to be. Martin Reeves had been standing near the cloakroom when it happened. He was 71 years old, and had spent 50 of those years practicing law, and he had learned long ago that the most significant moments in a legal case rarely announce themselves as such in advance. He had watched the entire sequence, the spill, the confrontation, the blow, the departure with the focus of a man who has been waiting 7 years for a signal, and he was fairly certain he had just received it. He collected his coat from the cloakroom attendant, slipped out through the side entrance, and found Angela in the parking structure, 2 levels down, sitting on a concrete barrier, her cleaning cart beside her, her hands folded in her lap. "Angela," he said. She looked up. "Are you all right?" She considered the question with the care she gave all questions. "My face hurts," she said. "The rest of me is fine." Martin sat down beside her. He reached into the briefcase he carried everywhere, the worn leather one she had seen in his office 100 times, and he removed a folder thick, indexed, bound with a rubber band that he had replaced twice in the 7 years he had been carrying the thing around, in anticipation of this moment. He set it on his knee. "Your father," he said, "was a precise man. He built things carefully. He made sure the foundations were correct before he worried about the walls." He paused. "He knew this day might come. He wanted you to be ready for it." Angela looked at the folder. "It's been ready for a long time, Martin. I know. I kept thinking I needed more time, more documentation, more certainty. And now?" She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the parking structure hummed with the low ambient sound of the city outside traffic, a distant siren, the muffled pulse of the party still going on 11 floors above them. She thought about her father, about the way he had talked about the company in the evenings when she was young, not with pride exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who loved a thing that was complicated, who understood that building something meant accepting responsibility for everything it became. She thought about Marcus, who saved her coffee, about Denise, who called her Miss Angela, about the 12 people on the loading dock who had not had a raise in 4 years. "Tell the board," she said, "that I want a meeting." Martin nodded and picked up his phone. The video arrived on the internet sometime around midnight. Nobody at the gala had posted it intentionally. It had been captured peripherally by a guest whose phone camera had been rolling during a selfie attempt, and it ended up shared through a chain of private messages before someone made the decision to put it into wider circulation. By the time the first Sterling Holdings executive checked their news alerts over breakfast the following morning, it had been viewed over 400,000 times. By mid-morning, the number had crossed 2 million. The footage was 17 seconds long. It showed, with the unambiguous clarity of a well-lit indoor space, Richard Sterling raising his hand and striking a woman in a cleaning uniform across the face. It showed her stillness afterward. It showed, in the background, the frozen expressions of 300 witnesses who did not intervene. And it ended, jarringly, with Richard turning back to his investors and straightening his jacket as though the previous 10 seconds had been a minor inconvenience successfully managed. People watched those final 3 seconds more than any others. The straightening of the jacket was, in many ways, worse than the blow itself. It communicated a man so accustomed to his own authority that consequences had simply not entered his field of vision. Sterling Holdings stock opened the morning down 4%. By 10 o'clock, it had dropped 9%. The trading platform flagged the movement for unusual volatility. 3 institutional investors placed review calls to the company's investor relations office before 11. By noon, the office had stopped answering. Richard Sterling spent the morning in his corner office, on the 34th floor, cycling through responses, first dismissiveness, then controlled concern, then something closer to genuine alarm, as his communications team presented him with coverage that was, in tone and scope, catastrophic. His attorney recommended he say nothing. His public relations director recommended he say something conciliatory. His chief of staff recommended he find out, before doing anything else, exactly how bad the legal exposure was. All of them were giving good advice, Richard understood. He simply could not focus on any of it. Richard, who had spent his entire professional life operating from a position of unquestioned authority, found that he did not know how to process being unquestionably in the wrong. He kept returning, in his thoughts, to the moment itself, the corridor, the spill, the woman in the gray uniform, and framing it from different angles, looking for the version in which he was reasonable, in which she had provoked him sufficiently, in which the context explained the outcome. He could not find that version. He had looked at 17 seconds of footage of himself, and he did not recognize the man in it as the man he believed himself to be. That disconnect was more frightening to him than the stock price. The emergency board meeting was called for 2 o'clock. Richard walked into the conference room on the 41st floor with his shoulders back and his expression calibrated, regretful, but controlled, the body language of a man who had made an error and was prepared to address it professionally. He had done this before, the correction and recovery maneuver, and he was good at it. The board, he told himself, knew him. They knew his results. They would weigh one bad moment against years of performance and find the scales tilted clearly in his favor. The 7 board members were already seated when he arrived. 3 of them avoided his eyes. The board chair, a 64-year-old woman named Patricia Holt, who had been on the board since before Richard's tenure, acknowledged him with a nod that contained, he thought, something he had never seen in her expression before, a kind of deliberate neutrality, the face of someone withholding judgment rather than conferring it. Richard took his seat at the head of the table. His attorney sat to his left. Martin Reeves, Richard noticed, was seated at the far end of the room, near the window, with an open briefcase in front of him. Richard had no idea who Martin Reeves was. "Before we begin," Patricia said, "I need to inform the room that we've received a formal legal communication this morning from counsel representing a major shareholder. That counsel has requested that the shareholder be permitted to attend this meeting." She looked at Richard. "I've consulted with our legal team and have determined that this request must be accommodated." Richard looked at his attorney, who gave him a small, careful nod that communicated something without specifying what. "Who is the shareholder?" Richard asked. Patricia looked at the door. "The holder of 51% of Sterling Holdings' outstanding shares," she said, "has arrived." The door opened. Angela Brooks walked into the conference room of the company her father had helped build, wearing a charcoal blazer over a simple white blouse, her hair pulled back, her posture the same as it always was, straight, unhurried, carrying within it the particular quality of calm that belongs to people who have spent a long time deciding who they are and have arrived at an answer they trust. She carried nothing except a small leather portfolio. Martin Reeves rose from his chair near the window and pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table from Patricia Holt, and Angela sat in it, and for a moment the room was as silent as the corridor of the Harrington Grand had been 20 hours before. Richard Sterling stared at her. He knew her face. He had seen it every working day for 7 years, in corridors and lobbies, and once or twice in the elevator, the woman in the gray uniform who was always moving, always cleaning, always somehow already there when you arrived at a space and still there after you left. He had never spoken to her before last night. He had never thought to. "This," he said, and in his voice was not quite disbelief but something adjacent to it, "is a joke." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved to confirm his interpretation. Martin Reeves reached into his briefcase and began distributing documents around the table, copies for each board member, for Richard's attorney, for Richard himself. Richard looked at the first page. His eyes moved across it. He turned to the next page, and then the next. And the careful architecture of what had been assembled there, the trust instrument, the share transfer documentation, the certified copies of probate filings, the legal opinion letters from 2 independent firms, began to make its full meaning known to him, the way cold water makes itself known when you're not expecting it. "This is not possible," he said. "It's entirely possible," Angela said from the far end of the table. Her voice was the same voice she had used in the corridor of the Harrington Grand, measured, clear, carrying no particular heat. "My father, Thomas Brooks, co-founded this company with your father, Gerald Sterling, in the spring 31 years ago. They were equal partners. The original articles of incorporation are in the documents Martin has distributed, page 17, if you'd like to confirm. When my father died, his share was placed in a revocable trust with specified conditions. Those conditions have been met. The transfer to my name was completed and registered with the relevant regulatory bodies 14 months ago." The room was very still. "The reason," Angela continued, "that none of you knew about this is that I chose not to tell you. That was my right under the terms of the trust, which permitted me to hold the interest privately for a period of up to 5 years following the transfer. I exercised that right while I continued to observe the company." She looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. I should tell you that my observations were thorough. Richard's attorney leaned over and said something quiet in his ear. Richard did not appear to hear it. He was looking at Angela with an expression that was cycling through several things simultaneously: disbelief, dawning recognition, something that was beginning to resemble, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, genuine fear. Not the manageable fear of a difficult quarter or a critical news cycle. The deeper fear of a man realizing that the ground beneath a structure he has stood on for years has always been someone else's property. "You've been working as a janitor," he said slowly, as though saying it aloud might help him understand it. "As a facilities staff member," Angela said. "Yes, for 7 years. For 7 years." He stared at her. "Why?" Angela set her portfolio on the table and folded her hands on top of it. "My father used to say that you can learn more about a company by watching how it treats the people who clean its floors than by reading any annual report." She let that sit for a moment. "I wanted to know what kind of company this was. Not the company it claimed to be in its mission statements or its press releases. The actual company. The one that exists when nobody important is watching." She opened the portfolio. What came next took 45 minutes. Angela had prepared the presentation over several months, working in evenings at her kitchen table, cross-referencing notes she had made over years, observations recorded in small notebooks she kept in her apartment, dates and names and incidents that had accumulated into patterns, patterns that became a picture that was by any measure not flattering. She walked the board through it methodically. The loading dock staffing records, showing compensation stagnation across a period of significant company growth. The HR complaint logs from 3 departments, showing a pattern of concerns raised and minimally addressed. The performance review data showing systematic scoring disparities that correlated in ways that were statistically significant with factors that had nothing to do with performance. The recordings legally obtained. She clarified of several meetings in which Richard Sterling had addressed his team in terms that no employment attorney in the country would have characterized as leadership. She was not emotional about any of it. She presented the information the way her father had built things carefully, with solid foundations, with each element connected to the next, in a way that made the overall structure unmistakable. The board members read and listened. Richard's attorney occasionally made notes. Richard himself sat very still, and the stillness of him was different from Angela's stillness, where hers was the quality of someone at rest. His was the quality of someone who has stopped knowing what to do. When Angela finished, Patricia Holt looked at the board. "I think we need to discuss next steps," she said. "I'd like to say something first," Richard said. Everyone looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the calibrated control he usually maintained in meetings. "I know what that video shows," he said. "I know what I did. I've been sitting with it since midnight, trying to find a way to frame it that makes me look like less of what I obviously am in that footage, and I can't." He looked at Angela. "What I did to you was wrong. It was wrong in every way that something can be wrong. I don't have an explanation that makes it acceptable." Angela waited. "I'm not saying that to avoid consequences," he added. "I'm saying it because it's true, and because I think you probably know whether I'm being genuine, and you deserve to hear it either way." The board discussed the question of Richard's position for just under an hour, in terms that were formal and measured, and that arrived, without significant divergence, at a conclusion that had likely been apparent to everyone in the room within the first 20 minutes of Angela's presentation. The vote was 6-1 Richard's seat, did not carry a vote in matters relating to his own tenure, so he sat and listened, while the 6 independent board members determined that his continuation as chief executive was untenable. The single dissenting vote came from a board member who argued for a 90-day remediation process rather than immediate removal. He was outvoted clearly, but his suggestion was noted in the minutes. Richard walked out of the building that evening, carrying a cardboard box that his assistant had quietly prepared sometime between the vote and the end of the formal proceedings. He walked through the lobby past the security desk, where Marcus was working the evening shift, who watched him go without expression, and through the revolving door onto the street, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the autumn air, holding his box, looking at the building that bore his family's name, trying to understand the shape of what had just happened to him. Pedestrians moved around him on both sides with the unconcerned efficiency of people who have somewhere to be. None of them knew who he was. None of them looked up. The building's glass facade reflected the early evening sky in a long, cold rectangle of blue, and Richard looked at it and thought, with a clarity that felt new and uncomfortable, that he had spent years looking at this building and seeing himself in it, his name, his inheritance, his future, and had never once looked at the same glass and tried to see the people inside. He had always known in some abstract way that power was not permanent. He had simply never applied that knowledge to himself. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Richard Sterling had experienced. Angela had made an offer, communicated through Martin Reeves and subsequently ratified by the board, that contained what she described as a pathway, not a punishment. She was careful to clarify, but a structured process through which Richard could, if he chose, earn a role in the company's future. The conditions were specific, and, to Richard's credit, he accepted them without significant negotiation. The first condition was a public apology, not a statement drafted by a communications team and distributed through a press release, but an in-person address to the assembled staff of Sterling Holdings, delivered in the main auditorium on a Tuesday morning, with every employee present who could physically attend, and a live feed for the satellite offices. Richard stood at the podium without notes and spoke for 12 minutes, and he said the things that needed to be said, and he said them in the right order, beginning with the specific wrong, moving through acknowledgement without excuse, arriving at a commitment that was concrete rather than vague. He did not use the word regret, which is the word people use when they want to acknowledge a feeling without accepting responsibility for what produced it. He used the word wrong, repeatedly, applied directly to his own actions. Several employees cried. Several did not. What nearly all of them agreed on, comparing notes afterward, was that it had sounded like a person speaking rather than a brand managing its image. The second condition was a placement program. For 8 weeks, Richard Sterling was assigned to work alongside employees in roles he had previously regarded as infrastructure: the loading dock crew, the building maintenance team, the reception staff, the IT support desk, the facilities staff. He wore whatever uniform the role required. He punched in at the same time as everyone else. He received the same supervision. He was given no special treatment, and he was told by the relevant supervisors, who had been briefed by Angela's team, that their only obligation was to treat him as they would any new employee. The first week was genuinely difficult. Richard had not performed physical labor in 20 years, and his body registered the 5:30 morning shift on the loading dock, with the unambiguous displeasure of muscles, long unasked to work in that way. The second difficulty was social learning how to exist in a space without the authority gradient he had always relied on, without being the person whose presence changed the energy in a room, without having his opinions sought or his jokes encouraged. In his second week, a supervisor named Gerald, who had been with the company for 14 years and had never once been invited to an executive floor, corrected him, in front of 3 other workers, for improperly stacking pallets in a way that created a tip hazard. Richard's instinct was immediate and familiar. Defensiveness, the urge to explain, to establish that he understood the principle even if the execution had been imperfect. He caught the instinct. He said thank you. He restacked the pallets correctly. That moment, small as it was, stayed with him. He spent a week with the facilities team. He was assigned, on his 3rd day, to clean the executive corridor, the one he had walked down every morning for 8 years, never registering the effort that went into its appearance. He pushed the cart that Angela had pushed. He used the products she had used. He learned by doing it that the marble floor required 3 passes with different cloths to achieve the even finish it displayed every morning, that the restrooms required 40 minutes of careful work per shift if done properly, that the motion of wringing out a mop 200 times in a morning produced a specific fatigue in the forearms that he had never had occasion to notice before. He thought about Angela every day during those 8 weeks, not with guilt exactly. Guilt was what he felt on his behalf, but with something he had no previous experience naming, a kind of recognition that arrived late, the way recognition does when the thing being recognized is not an idea but a person you failed to see. Angela, meanwhile, had begun the work of reimagining Sterling Holdings in ways that were structural rather than cosmetic. She did not arrive on the 41st floor with a manifesto or a dramatic reorganization chart. She arrived with questions. She spent her first month as executive chair conducting listening sessions with employees across every level of the company, not focus groups facilitated by HR, but small, informal conversations held in break rooms and conference spaces where she asked people what was working, what wasn't, and what they would change if they believed anyone with the power to do so was genuinely listening. The response was overwhelming. People had things to say. They had been saying them, in some cases for years, into a vacuum, and the experience of being heard by someone who then actually changed things, based on what they heard, produced an organizational energy that surprised even Angela in its scope and speed. The compensation review she commissioned identified 23 job classifications across the company that were demonstrably below market rate, including every position in facilities, security, and building operations. The adjustments were implemented over a 4-month period, funded in part by restructuring an executive bonus program that had been, in Angela's assessment, rewarding outcomes in ways that had no reliable relationship to the effort producing them. The new policy was carefully explained in company-wide communications that used plain language and named the specific changes and the reasoning behind them. Several senior managers were unhappy. Most of them stayed anyway, because the overall direction of the company was suddenly clearer and more coherent than it had been in years, and clarity, it turned out, is its own form of incentive. She established a formal values framework, not the kind that gets laminated and mounted in lobbies and never spoken of again, but a living document that was reviewed quarterly, and against which decisions at every level were explicitly measured. She required that the framework be referenced in performance reviews, in hiring decisions, in vendor evaluations. She hired an external ethics officer whose role was specifically designed to be independent of the executive team, with a reporting line directly to the board. She mandated training across the organization on topics that had previously been addressed, if at all, through brief annual compliance modules that employees clicked through with minimal engagement. 6 months after the events of the Summer Charity Gala, a major workplace culture research firm published its annual index of best employers in the sector. Sterling Holdings appeared on the list for the first time in 11 years. The firm's researchers cited, in their commentary, the combination of compensation equity, communication transparency, and notably what they described as a visible leadership commitment to the dignity of every role within the organization. Angela read that phrase and set the report down and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, which was not the corner office on the 34th floor that Richard had occupied. She had chosen a smaller space on the 28th floor with a view of the street rather than the skyline, because she found the street more interesting and thought about her father. Thomas Brooks had been a quiet man, a careful man, a man who built things properly and then stepped back to let them become what they were meant to be, without requiring that his name be on the front of the building. He had told her once, when she was 16, and frustrated by what she perceived as his willingness to let others take credit for work he had contributed to substantially, that the measure of a person was not how much of the visible surface they occupied, but how much of the invisible foundation they had helped lay. At the time, she had found this unsatisfying. In retrospect, she understood that he had been trying to give her a vocabulary for a kind of strength she would not fully encounter until much later. He had made Angela promise, in the last months of his life, that she would trust her own judgment about when the right moment was, and not before. He had told her that impatience was the enemy of justice, not because justice required suffering, but because understanding required time, and you could not lead what you did not understand. She had understood that. It had taken her longer than she expected to trust it. Richard Sterling completed his placement program in the 7th week of the 8 originally planned. He was not released early as a reward, or kept longer as a punishment the week he lost was due to an illness, and Angela's team offered to extend the program. He declined. He said he didn't want anything to be given to him that he hadn't completed. In his final week, he returned to the facilities team for 2 days. He worked alongside a young woman named Priya, 24 years old, who had been with the team for 8 months and who did not know, until her supervisor told her at the end of the shift that the quiet man she'd been showing how to properly descale a bathroom fixture was the former CEO. Her reaction when told was to be quiet for a moment and then say, "He asked a lot of good questions." At the end of the 8 weeks, Richard submitted a written reflection, another condition of the agreement, that Angela read in her office on a Thursday afternoon. It was 9 pages, handwritten, and it covered ground that she had not required him to cover. It talked about his father, about the version of ambition he had inherited versus the version he had chosen, about the specific experience of being corrected by Gerald, the 14-year loading dock supervisor, and what it had felt like to say thank you and mean it, about what he now understood power to be, for not the consolidation of one person's position, but the creation of conditions in which other people could do their best work. He closed with a question. He asked whether, having completed the process, he might be considered for a role within the company. Not an executive role, a position in operations, at whatever level Angela and the board considered appropriate, where he could apply what he had learned within the structure of actual accountability. Angela showed the letter to Martin Reeves, who read it carefully and said, "What do you want to do?" "I think," Angela said, "that my father would say, a person who does the work deserves the chance to do more of it." Martin nodded. "What do you say?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the street was busy with the particular energy of late afternoon delivery trucks, pedestrians, a group of children in school uniforms navigating around an elderly man walking a small dog. She watched them for a moment, the ordinary, uncelebrated motion of people going about their lives with care. "I say the same thing," she said. Richard was offered a position as operations coordinator in the facilities division, a mid-level management role that carried real responsibility without executive authority, and that reported through the standard organizational structure to a department head who reported to a vice president who reported to the executive team. He accepted it. He started on a Monday. He wore the same badge as everyone else. 1 year after the summer charity gala, Sterling Holdings posted its strongest financial results in company history. The growth was attributed, in the analysis circulated to shareholders, to a combination of improved operational efficiency, stronger employee retention, which had increased by 31% over the preceding 12 months, and a measurable improvement in customer satisfaction scores that correlated with what the analysts described as a more engaged and stable workforce. The stock price had recovered fully by the third month and continued to rise through the year. The annual gala was held again at the Harrington Grand, as it always had been. The theme this year was community, chosen by a committee of employees from across the organization, who had been given the task and a modest budget and left to make something of both. The ballroom was full. The Children's Educational Foundations received their largest donation in the event's history. The keynote address was delivered not by the executive chair but by a woman from the loading dock team who had been with Sterling Holdings for 16 years and who spoke, without notes, for 7 minutes about what it meant to feel that the place where you spent 8 hours of your day saw you as a person. Angela was in the audience. She wore the same charcoal blazer from the board meeting, which had become, in the year since, something of a signature. She listened to the speech and applauded with everyone else, and afterward moved through the room in the way she had always moved through rooms, unhurried, present, paying attention. She was near the East Corridor, speaking with Patricia Holt about the upcoming board calendar, when she heard the sound, the distinctive sound of something liquid encountering marble, the slight yelp of a young person's embarrassment. She turned and saw a young man in a new facilities uniform, barely 20 years old, standing over a spilled bucket of cleaning solution, his face flushed with the particular mortification of someone who has made a mistake in front of people whose opinions matter to them. Angela excused herself from Patricia and walked over. She picked up the fallen bucket, righted it, and crouched beside the young man to help him gather the cleaning cloths that had scattered across the floor. He looked at her, recognized her, and began apologizing rapidly, stumbling over the words. "It's all right," she said. "It happens. Let's just clean it up properly so nobody slips." They worked together for 3 minutes. Angela directing, the young man executing, the task completed with the quiet efficiency that good work always carries, and when they were done, Angela stood, And the young man stood, and he was still pink with residual embarrassment. She looked at him, and in her face was the same quality of attention she had been giving to people all her life, that full, present, unhurried attention that made you feel, on the receiving end of it, that you were being seen accurately rather than managed. The value of a person, she said, has nothing to do with the uniform they're wearing. The young man nodded. Remember that in both directions, she added, for yourself and for everyone you work with. She set her hand briefly on his shoulder, then turned and walked back toward the center of the room, back into the light of the chandelier and the warmth of the gathering, and the gala continued around her, carrying with it the accumulated weight of everything that had changed in a year which was considerable, and everything that had remained the same, which was the simple, durable fact that the work of building something worth building is never finished, only deepened, one small, honest choice at a time.